Here's a photograph of one of the grimmest, darkest moments of your life, a reminder of it. This is Johnny Stompanato.
No, that is Tyrone Power.
Oh, well, we skipped what happened to 16-319. That certainly is Tyrone Power.
Yes.
Are we out of sync?
There
here,
is
friend?
Mr. Stompanato.
There he is. All right. This is Stompanato. This was a... How do you want to... We better dismiss this at the top. It's okay we talk to you about it. Your daughter interrupted what she perceived to be a situation in her own house which was threatening to her mother.
Yes.
And stabbed Johnny. He dies. She's subsequently acquitted. And I hope you'll bear up for how could a nice girl like you get involved with a guy like that?
They smiled for the cameras. They dazzled the world. But behind every legend of Hollywood's golden age lurked secrets so devastating, so carefully buried, that entire industries existed just to keep them hidden. What you're about to hear changed everything. Lana Turner was discovered, the legend said, sitting on a stool at a Hollywood soda fountain. A teenager so beautiful that a film industry talent scout stopped in his tracks and changed both their lives. That story became one of Hollywood's most beloved myths. But behind the platinum glamour and the sweater girl image lived a woman whose real life bore almost no resemblance to the fairy tale, and whose secrets were so explosive that an entire apparatus of MGM fixers devoted years of their careers to keeping them buried. What the public never knew was that Turner's childhood had been marked by violence and abandonment long before Hollywood found her. Her father, Virgil Turner, was murdered in a robbery when Lana was 9 years old, shot and killed with the dice winnings he'd carried in his shoe. That loss hollowed something out in her permanently. Friends who knew her in her early years reported that she never fully recovered from the sense that the people she loved most were capable of disappearing without warning, and that this foundational terror drove every reckless decision she made for the rest of her life. The most shocking secret was that Turner's famous discovery at the Top Hat Mall shop was not the innocent encounter the studio publicized for decades. MGM's own internal records, reviewed by researchers years later, revealed that the accidental meeting had been partially arranged by someone already aware of the teenager's looks. The myth of the soda fountain was polished and promoted because it was wholesome and irresistible. The truth was more calculating, and Turner was its object, not its agent, from the very beginning. The most heartbreaking aspect of Turner's life was her relationship with her daughter Cheryl Crane, who at 14 years old fatally stabbed Turner's boyfriend, Johnny Stompanato, in April 1958. What the public saw was a tabloid sensation, a Hollywood mother, a dangerous gangster, a teenage girl with a kitchen knife. What the public did not see was the years of escalating abuse that had preceded that night, Stompanato's documented violence toward both mother and daughter, and Turner's paralyzing terror of a man connected to Mickey Cohen's criminal organization, a man she had not known how to leave. Studio fixers at MGM mobilized within hours of Stompanato's death. Evidence was managed, statements were coordinated, and the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, well accustomed to the studio's reach, proceeded with a coroner's inquest rather than criminal charges. The verdict of justifiable homicide was delivered in days. What was never publicly examined was the question of whether Cheryl had acted alone or had shielded her mother from consequences that would have been far more severe for an adult. Friends reported that Turner carried the weight of that night until her final breath. She provided for Cheryl, loved her fiercely in her complicated way, and spent her later years attempting a closeness that had always eluded them both. When Lana Turner passed away in 1995 from throat cancer, Cheryl was at her side, still protecting, still loyal, still bound to a mother whose beauty had attracted a darkness neither of them had chosen and neither had ever fully escaped. Frank Sinatra was the voice of the American century. From the swooning Bobby Soxers of the 1940s to the martini-cool swagger of the Rat Pack years, he embodied a kind of masculine confidence that the country wanted to believe in. But behind the chairman of the board lived a man tormented by a family history so painful and personal failures so carefully concealed that they shaped every relationship he ever had. What the public never knew was that Sinatra's mother, Dolly, was one of the most powerful figures in Hoboken's underground network of illegal services, including performing illegal procedures for women in desperate circumstances. Dolly operated this network for years while Frank was growing up. He knew. He protected her secret his entire life. and the psychological weight of that complicity, of loving a mother who committed acts he knew were illegal and dangerous, haunted him in ways he could never openly address. The most shocking secret was the circumstances surrounding Sinatra's birth. He was delivered in a difficult labor that doctors initially believed had ended in tragedy. The infant Frank was set aside, presumed stillborn, while doctors focused on saving Dolly. It was his grandmother who noticed he was still breathing and plunged him into cold water to stimulate a response. He survived, but left with a scarred cheek and a punctured eardrum from the forceps used during delivery. Frank Sinatra, whose voice was his entire identity, was nearly deaf in one ear for his entire life. The most heartbreaking aspect was his relationship with his children, particularly Nancy, and Frank Jr. Friends reported that Sinatra genuinely adored his children, but was utterly incapable of expressing that love without the armor of control and authority. He showed love through gifts, through power, through arranging and fixing, never through simple presence or vulnerability. His children grew up with a father who would move mountains for them, and yet couldn't sit quietly in a room with them. The cover-up of Sinatra's mob connections extended deep into his personal life. Meetings with figures like Sam Giancana weren't merely professional. They were personal friendships cemented over years, and the FBI surveillance that documented them created a sword hanging permanently over Sinatra's head. Studio executives, record label heads, and political figures all knew the files existed. That knowledge gave others leverage over a man who otherwise permitted none. When Sinatra passed away in 1998, his daughter Nancy held his hand and said he left peacefully. His final words, reportedly, were, "I'm losing." It was the most honest thing the most guarded man in show business had ever said in public. An acknowledgement that the fight he'd been waging his entire life, the fight to control the story, to protect the secrets, to keep the walls standing, had finally come to its inevitable end. Montgomery Clift was considered by many critics to be the finest actor of his generation. His performances in A Place in the Sun and From Here to Eternity carried an emotional honesty so raw and so precise that audiences recognized something genuine in him that most stars carefully avoided showing. But behind that luminous vulnerability lived a man whose private anguish was destroying him long before the car accident that shattered his face and defined his public tragedy. What the public never knew was that Clift had been engaged in a secret romantic relationship with a fellow actor for years before his career reached its peak. A relationship that MGM and Paramount worked together to suppress with an efficiency that bordered on the terrifying. Private investigators followed Clift. His mail was intercepted. His telephone calls were monitored. The studios invested enormous resources in controlling a man whose only crime was loving someone he wasn't permitted to love. The most shocking secret was the role that Clift's own mother, Ethel, played in his psychological destruction. Ethel Clift was a domineering, obsessive presence who had convinced herself, and worked hard to convince Monty, that they shared a bond deeper than ordinary mother and son. She managed his finances, screened his friendships, and inserted herself into his romantic life in ways that those close to him described as deeply damaging. Clift spent years in psychoanalysis trying to understand why he couldn't form lasting attachments, never fully recognizing that the answer sat across from him at every family dinner. The most heartbreaking aspect was the night of May 12, 1956, when Clift's car left the road on Mulholland Drive after a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's home. Taylor herself pulled Clift from the wreckage and held him in her arms, pulling 2 dislodged teeth from his throat to prevent him from choking. She saved his life, but the man she saved was not the same man who had driven up the hill that evening. The accident broke bones and crushed his sinuses, but the deeper damage was to his sense of himself as a beautiful, desirable, capable human being. Studio fixers worked quickly to reshape the narrative around the accident, emphasizing his physical injuries and downplaying witness accounts that suggested Clift had been drinking heavily. The cover-up was effective, but incomplete. Clift knew what everyone was not saying, and the shame of it accelerated his retreat into alcohol and prescription medication. Friends reported that in his final years, Clift would sometimes look at photographs of himself from before the accident with an expression they could only describe as grief. He passed away in 1966, at the age of 45, his heart finally giving out. Elizabeth Taylor, who had loved him with a fierce and sisterly devotion, said afterward that Monty had been on an 18-year death wish. She was right, and the system that had demanded he hide who he was had handed him a match. Ava Gardner was, by common agreement, the most beautiful woman Hollywood ever produced. Her dark eyes and languid grace made men lose their reason, and she moved through the world with a kind of elemental confidence that the cameras worshipped. But behind the goddess lived a woman from a poor North Carolina tobacco farm who never once believed she deserved the adoration she received, and who paid for that disbelief with a lifetime of loneliness. What the public never knew was that Gardner's first marriage to Mickey Rooney in 1942 ended in part because of MGM's deliberate interference. Studio head Louis B. Mayer had approved the marriage as a publicity move, but quickly decided that Gardner's growing popularity made her more valuable as an unattached fantasy figure. Mayer's operatives began feeding Rooney information about Gardner's friendships with other men, some fabricated, some exaggerated, until the marriage collapsed under the weight of manufactured suspicion. Gardner spent years believing she had failed at marriage. She had, in truth, been sabotaged. The most shocking secret was the full extent of Gardner's relationship with Frank Sinatra, which the public knew as passionate and volatile, but could not have known was also profoundly codependent in ways that left both of them permanently damaged. Sinatra, by Gardner's own private account to close friends, could be emotionally cruel in ways that would never appear in any authorized biography, and yet she returned to him repeatedly, unable to disentangle love from pain, a pattern established long before she ever met him. The most heartbreaking aspect was Gardner's 3 pregnancies, none of which she was permitted to carry to term. Studio contracts in that era contained morality clauses and image requirements that made motherhood professionally catastrophic for an unmarried star. Gardner underwent procedures she never fully recovered from emotionally, and friends reported that she wept privately for the children she never had throughout her entire adult life. The cover-up of Gardner's health in her final decades was managed by a small circle of loyal friends who kept the press away from the reality of her decline. She had suffered a series of strokes that left her partially paralyzed and largely confined to her London apartment. A woman who had once been photographed in every glamorous location on Earth, now unable to leave her building without assistance. The contrast between the legend and the reality was something she bore with extraordinary dignity. When Gardner passed away in 1990, she had asked to be buried in the red Carolina clay of her home state. Far from Hollywood, far from the studio system that had shaped and exploited her, close to the tobacco fields where a poor girl had grown up with no idea that the world was about to decide she was the most beautiful thing it had ever seen. She was finally home, and she was finally, mercifully, free. Spencer Tracy occupied a unique place in Hollywood's moral imagination. Twice an Academy Award winner, the embodiment of straightforward American decency on screen, he was considered by peers, including Laurence Olivier, to be simply the greatest film actor who ever lived. His performances felt less like acting than like witnessing. But behind the bedrock integrity of the screen persona lived a man whose private life was a landscape of devastation he visited on nearly everyone who loved him. What the public never knew was the full severity of Tracy's alcoholism. Not the romanticized version of the hard-drinking Irish-American actor that the press was happy to print, but the clinical, destructive reality of a man who would disappear for days at a time, violent and unrecognizable, destroying hotel rooms, threatening strangers, and requiring teams of MGM fixers to retrieve him from situations that would have ended any other career on any other day. The most shocking secret was Tracy's treatment of his wife, Louise, who had dedicated her life to their son John, who was born deaf, and to building an institution for the deaf in his honor. While Louise quietly transformed personal tragedy into public service and became one of the most respected women in Los Angeles, Tracy was conducting a decades-long affair with Katharine Hepburn that he refused to end and refused to formalize. He would not divorce Louise. His Catholic faith forbade it, but he would not return her either. He left her suspended in an impossible position for the rest of his life. The most heartbreaking aspect was the relationship between Tracy and Hepburn, which the world has romanticized into one of Hollywood's great love stories. What the romance obscures is that Hepburn sacrificed enormous portions of her own career and personal freedom to manage a man who could be, by her own carefully worded private accounts. Impossible. She arranged her schedule around his instability, turned down roles that required her to be away from him, and bore the social stigma of the affair in silence, because she loved him and because, friends believed, she had convinced herself that she alone could save him. Studio executives at MGM protected Tracy with a ferocity that reflected both his box office value and a culture that simply did not hold powerful men accountable for their private behavior. When Tracy's drinking resulted in an incident involving a young woman at a hotel in New York, the story was buried so completely that it has never been definitively reported. The woman involved was quietly compensated, the hotel staff was silenced, and Tracy was back on set within a week. Friends reported that Tracy, near the end of his life, was consumed by guilt, not about Hepburn, not about his career, but about Louise and John. He died in 1967, just 17 days after completing Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, a film about tolerance and love. Hepburn did not attend his funeral. She had loved him too much to stand at his grave and pretend that everything between them had been simple. It never had been. Rock Hudson was Hollywood's ideal of masculine American beauty in the 1950s. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked carved from good intentions. He was the romantic lead that studios dreamed of, dependable, handsome, and utterly unthreatening to the social order. But behind the wholesome image, the studio had constructed an elaborate fiction, and Hudson had agreed to inhabit it fully, at a cost to his soul that only became visible when there was nothing left to lose. What the public never knew was the degree to which Universal Studios engineered Hudson's manufactured heterosexual persona. When rumors about Hudson's private life began circulating in the early 1950s, studio head Henry Wilson, himself a deeply closeted man who preyed on the young actors he represented, arranged for Hudson to marry his secretary, Phyllis Gates, in 1955. Gates later claimed she had not fully understood the arrangement she was entering. Hudson understood it completely. It was a business transaction dressed as a love story. The most shocking secret was the extent of Hudson's personal sacrifice. He was, by all accounts of those who knew him privately, a warm, funny, deeply loving man who formed genuine and lasting bonds with the people in his life. He wanted what most people want: a partner, a home, a life lived openly. Instead, he spent 30 years performing a version of himself for public consumption that had almost nothing to do with who he actually was. The performance never stopped. Not at premieres, not at interviews, not in the magazine profiles where he discussed his ideal woman with a practiced sincerity that must have cost him something every single time. The most heartbreaking aspect was Hudson's friendship with Doris Day, which was entirely genuine and which Day has spoken about with great tenderness. She did not know the truth about Hudson's life until the world found out together. When she learned he had been diagnosed with AIDS, she was devastated, not by the revelation of who he was, but by the knowledge of what he had carried alone for so long. Their friendship, she said, was the most real thing she took from Hollywood. She had no idea how real his need for it had been. The cover-up of Hudson's diagnosis in 1984 and 1985 involved his management, his studio relationships, and even elements of the French medical establishment, as Hudson sought experimental treatment in Paris. The press was told he had inoperable liver cancer. The truth emerged anyway. It always does, when Hudson appeared visibly ill at a press event for Doris Day's television project. The photographs circle the world. Hudson chose, in the end, to tell the truth publicly, becoming the first major American celebrity to confirm an AIDS diagnosis. That decision, made when there was nothing left to protect, may have done more good than all his films combined. Rock Hudson passed away in October 1985. He was 59 years old. He had been one of the most famous men in the world for 30 years, and almost no one had known him. What he left behind was not just a filmography, but a permission. The slow, painful, posthumous permission for those who came after him to live a little more honestly than he had been allowed to live. Dorothy Dandridge was a woman of such beauty and talent that Hollywood simply did not know what to do with her. Her 1954 Academy Award nomination for Carmen Jones made her the first black woman ever nominated for the Best Actress Oscar. A milestone so historic, it should have opened every door in the industry. Instead, it opened almost none. And behind the triumph of that nomination lived a woman whose life was being quietly destroyed by a system that admired her from a distance and refused to bring her inside. What the public never knew was that Dandridge's childhood had been a chronicle of trauma that would have broken most people before they reached adulthood. Her mother, Ruby, was a performer who subjected Dorothy and her sister to a childhood managed and controlled by a woman named Geneva Williams, whom the family called Annie Mama, a woman who was later revealed to have subjected the girls to severe physical and emotional abuse. Dandridge carried those wounds into every relationship she formed as an adult. The most shocking secret was the deliberate and systematic limitation of Dandridge's career by studio executives who privately admired her talent and publicly claimed to champion her, but refused to cast her in the roles she was qualified for because they feared the reaction of Southern white audiences. After Carmen Jones, Dandridge was offered roles either as an exotic, sexualized other or nothing at all. Hollywood had created a ceiling and then congratulated itself for letting her get so close to it. The most heartbreaking aspect was Dandridge's daughter, Harolyn, born with severe brain damage. Dandridge devoted enormous financial resources to Harolyn's care throughout her career, resources that she earned through performances that deserved far greater compensation than she received, in a business that paid her less than her white contemporaries as a matter of standard practice. When her career declined and the money ran out, Dandridge was forced to place Harolyn in a state institution, a decision she described to friends as the worst moment of her life. The cover-up of Dandridge's financial collapse in her final years was something she managed alone, too proud and too private to let the world see. She had been swindled by a business manager who lost her savings in a fraudulent land scheme. She was reduced to performing in small clubs for a fraction of what she had once commanded. The woman who had been on the cover of Life magazine was sleeping in a near-empty apartment, her furniture repossessed, her career in ruins. Dorothy Dandridge was found dead in her West Hollywood apartment in September 1965. She was 42 years old. The cause was a barbiturate overdose. Accidental, the coroner ruled, though the question of whether anything about her death was truly accidental has never been fully settled. She left behind a legacy that Hollywood spent decades pretending to honor while learning almost nothing from her story. Halle Berry accepted her Academy Award in 2002 in explicit tribute to Dandridge. It was, at minimum, a beginning. James Dean lived only 24 years, made only 3 films, and became the permanent symbol of American youth's longing for something it couldn't name. His death in a car crash in September 1955 cemented a legend that has never dimmed. But behind the brooding icon lived a profoundly damaged young man whose rebellion wasn't performance. It was the only language he had left after a childhood that had taken everything from him. What the public never knew was the full impact of Dean's abandonment at age 9 when his mother, Mildred, died of uterine cancer and his father, Winton, sent him to live with relatives in Fairmount, Indiana, rather than raise him alone. Winton Dean did not attend his son's funeral in 1955. He was listed in the program as a survivor. James Dean's relationship with his father was a wound that never closed, a rejection so foundational that every role he ever played, every lost, yearning, fatherless young man on screen, was in some sense autobiographical. The most shocking secret was Dean's relationship with his agent and mentor, Rogers Brackett, an older man who had taken the struggling young actor under his wing in New York and provided both professional guidance and personal companionship. The relationship was the subject of intense private discussion in Hollywood circles and has been documented by biographers since Dean's death. But Warner Brothers worked hard to ensure it never entered the public narrative during the years when his legend was being constructed. Dean himself, when asked about it years later by a journalist, deflected with characteristic opacity. The most heartbreaking aspect was Dean's relationship with Pier Angeli, the Italian actress who became the great love of his short life. Angeli's mother and MGM both opposed the relationship, and when studio pressure and family opposition finally succeeded in separating them, Angeli married singer Vic Damone. Dean, by multiple accounts, sat on his motorcycle outside the church during the ceremony and listened to the bells. He drove away afterward and never fully came back from it. Friends reported that Dean, in the months before his death, had spoken about feeling that his time was limited, not with morbid certainty, but with the kind of restless, urgent energy of someone who understood intuitively that he was running out of road. He drove fast because he felt everything fast. He loved intensely because he'd learned early that love could be taken from him without warning. He performed brilliantly because the screen was the one place where the pain had somewhere to go. When Dean's Porsche 550 Spider collided with another car on Highway 46 near Chelan, California, he was killed instantly. The car had been nicknamed Little Bastard. Some found that darkly appropriate. Others found it heartbreaking. James Dean had been called worse things by people who should have loved him, and he had survived all of them, until the one thing he couldn't survive caught up with him on an empty stretch of California road. Joan Crawford clawed her way from poverty in San Antonio to the top of Hollywood's hierarchy through a combination of ferocious ambition, extraordinary physical discipline, and an almost inhuman capacity for reinvention. She was a survivor in an industry that ate survivors for breakfast, and the strength she projected on screen was entirely real. But behind the queen lived a woman whose childhood terrors had taught her that love and control were the same thing, and who passed that lesson on to her children with devastating consequences. What the public never knew was the full texture of Crawford's early life, including evidence suggesting she had performed in pornographic films early in her career, before her rise to MGM stardom. Louis B. Mayer was reportedly aware of this material's existence and used that knowledge as both leverage and insurance throughout Crawford's tenure at the studio. Crawford lived for decades with the awareness that this information existed and could be deployed against her. It shaped her relationship with power in ways that no amount of professional success could fully undo. The most shocking secret was the internal life of the Crawford household as experienced by her adopted children. Her daughter Christina's 1978 memoir, Mommy Dearest, presented a portrait of abuse so extreme that many in Hollywood initially dismissed it as exaggeration. But private accounts from those who had witnessed Crawford's parenting over the years, and from Christina's brother Christopher, corroborated the essential truth that Crawford's need for control expressed itself in her domestic life with the same absolute authority she demanded on set. The most heartbreaking aspect was that Crawford genuinely believed she was giving her children everything she had never had. She had grown up in genuine poverty, genuinely unloved, genuinely without resources or protection. She was providing. She was present. She was not going to let her children suffer what she had suffered. The tragedy was that her understanding of love had been so thoroughly corrupted by her own childhood that she could not distinguish between care and control, between protection and imprisonment. Studio executives at MGM and later at Warner Brothers treated Crawford's personal life as a PR management problem, deploying publicists to reshape narratives about her marriages, her adoptions, and her temperament. When her drinking became significant enough to affect her work, the issue was managed with the standard vocabulary of the era: exhaustion, rest, a private family matter. The apparatus of concealment was so well oiled by then that it functioned almost automatically. Joan Crawford passed away in 1977, alone in her New York apartment. Her will excluded Christina and Christopher from her estate, citing reasons known to them. Christina published Mommy Dearest the following year. The book and subsequent film ensured that the public image Crawford had spent 50 years constructing was permanently altered. Whatever the full truth of her motherhood, she deserved, in the end, what she had always needed and never quite received: the honest account of what had been done to her before she did it to anyone else. Dean Martin was the coolest man alive for about 30 years, and he made it look completely effortless. The voice, the glass, the half-lidded ease. Martin had perfected the art of appearing to not care about anything, including his own talent, which was in truth prodigious. But behind the most relaxed facade in show business lived a man whose emotional life was a controlled demolition that finally became uncontrolled when the one person he truly could not afford to lose was taken from him. What the public never knew was that Martin's famous drinking was, for most of his career, largely performance. His signature glass frequently contained apple juice. The drunk act was exactly that, an act carefully calibrated for an audience that found his apparent indifference both charming and comforting. The real Martin was a private, disciplined man who woke early, practiced his golf game with intense focus, and managed his professional life with considerably more attention than he wanted anyone to know. The most shocking secret was the depth and nature of Martin's partnership with Jerry Lewis, specifically how it ended. The public knew that the most successful comedy duo in American history had split acrimoniously in 1956. But what the public did not know was that Martin had reached a point of genuine psychological suffocation in the partnership. Lewis, by multiple accounts, had come to treat Martin as a supporting player in Lewis's own story, and Martin, proud, private, more sensitive than anyone suspected, had simply reached his limit. The split left Lewis publicly inconsolable and Martin publicly indifferent. In private, friends reported, both men were damaged by it in ways they never fully acknowledged. The most heartbreaking aspect of Dean Martin's life arrived on March 21st, 1987, when his son Dean Paul Martin was killed when his Air National Guard jet crashed into the San Gorgonio Mountains. Dean Paul was 35 years old. Martin never recovered. The man who had seemed immune to sentiment, who had built an entire persona on elegant detachment, was destroyed by grief in a way that all of his professional armor could not prevent. He withdrew from public life, declined invitations, stopped performing, and essentially disappeared into his Bel Air home. Friends reported that in his final years, Martin sat by the window for hours, listening to his own recordings. Not with nostalgia, they said, but with a kind of bewilderment, as if the voice coming from the speakers belonged to someone he could barely remember being. He had been so many things for so many people, and in the end, he could not perform his way out of the grief that had finally found him. Dean Martin died on Christmas morning, 1995. He was 78 years old. His daughter Gina said he had essentially decided to die after Dean Paul was killed, that he had lived 8 more years out of professional obligation and old habit. But the engine had stopped in 1987. The smile was real once. Then it was a job. Then even the job became too heavy to carry. Marlon Brando didn't just change acting. He dismantled it and rebuilt it from the inside out. His performances in A Streetcar Named Desire and The Godfather set a standard so high that actors are still measuring themselves against it 7 decades later. He was the most talented screen performer of the 20th century, and he knew it, and the knowing gave him very little peace. But behind the legend lived a man whose private family life was a slow-motion catastrophe that no amount of artistic genius could prevent or repair. What the public never knew was the full darkness of Brando's childhood, which he spent in Libertyville, Illinois, with a cold, alcoholic father who treated his son's sensitivity as a character defect requiring correction, and a mother whose own alcoholism left her unable to protect her children from the household's atmosphere of controlled cruelty. Brando Sr. made no secret of his contempt for his son's artistic ambitions, and Marlon carried that contempt inside him for the rest of his life, sometimes wearing it as defiance, sometimes as self-destruction, never fully free of it. The most shocking secret was the private history of Brando's 11 children born to at least 5 women, and the profound dysfunction that characterized nearly every branch of his extended family. Brando was simultaneously capable of overwhelming tenderness and complete emotional abandonment. He would shower a child with attention and then disappear for months. He provided financially with extraordinary generosity and withheld emotionally with equal thoroughness. His children grew up worshiping a father who was always elsewhere, always legendary, always just out of reach. The most heartbreaking aspect was the tragedy surrounding his son Christian and daughter Cheyenne. In May 1990, Christian Brando shot and killed Dag Drolet, the boyfriend of his half-sister Cheyenne, in a living room of Marlon's Mulholland Drive home. Cheyenne, who was pregnant with Drolet's child at the time, gave contradictory testimony and was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial. Marlon spent millions on Christian's defense and sat in the courtroom throughout the trial, an old man watching the accumulated wreckage of his family's private history play out under television lights. Christian was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years. Cheyenne took her own life in Tahiti in 1995 at the age of 25. The cover-up of the family's psychological history was something Brando had attempted for decades, deploying his considerable wealth and his natural authority to keep the press at a distance from the reality of his domestic life. Studio connections, legal resources, and the sheer force of his reputation had protected him from scrutiny that would have destroyed a lesser figure. But Christian's arrest removed every barrier at once. and the family's pain, years of it, generations of it, became public property overnight. Friends reported that Brando in his final years was consumed not by regret about his career, which he had always treated with a studied indifference that was partly genuine and partly performance, but by grief about his children, about what he had given them and what he had failed to give them, about the patterns handed down from his own father that he had promised himself he would break and had broken only partially. Marlon Brando died in July 2004, weighing over 300 pounds, his body a map of all the comfort he had sought and never quite found. He had shown the world everything about human longing through his art. He had shown almost no one the longing that lived in him. Humphrey Bogart built his legend on the architecture of controlled emotion. The tight jaw, the world-weary eyes, the voice that seemed to have already seen everything worth seeing and found it wanting. He was Hollywood's definitive existentialist, the man who understood that the world was a corrupt place and had decided to be honest about it. But behind a magnificent cynicism lived a man whose private tenderness was enormous, and whose 3 failed marriages had left him convinced, until the last one, that he was incapable of being loved. What the public never knew was that Bogart's scar, the distinctive mark at the corner of his lip that contributed to his trademark slight lisp, was not, as various studio publicists claimed over the years, a World War I wound. The scar's true origin has been disputed by biographers for decades, with accounts ranging from a childhood accident to an injury sustained during his own difficult youth. What is certain is that the mythology constructed around it served Warner Brothers' interests far better than the truth, whatever that truth was. The most shocking secret was the severity of Bogart's alcoholism during his marriages to Mayo Method, the actress who preceded Lauren Bacall. Their relationship was so mutually destructive, both drinking heavily, both prone to violence, that Hollywood insiders referred to them as the battling Bogarts with a knowing black humor that concealed genuine concern. Method, who had been a talented actress before the marriage consumed her, was left by the relationship with a ruined career, a drinking problem that would eventually kill her, and a humiliation she had earned press coverage for while Bogart moved on to Bacall and immortality. The most heartbreaking aspect was Bogart's relationship with his father, a cold and withholding physician who had treated his son's ambitions with contempt. Bogart spent his professional life proving himself to a man who died before the proof was complete. Friends reported that Bogart rarely spoke about his father, but when he did, the wound in his voice was audible beneath the characteristic irony, the sound of a man who had not been believed in by the person whose belief would have meant everything. The cover-up of Bogart's health in the final years of his life was managed by Bacall with fierce protectiveness. His esophageal cancer diagnosis in 1956 was kept private for as long as possible, and the visible deterioration of a man who had once seemed like he might outlast everything was witnessed only by those she allowed close. Bogart lost 60 pounds. He was carried down the stairs of his Holmby Hills home to receive visitors in a dumbwaiter when he could no longer manage the stairs himself. Humphrey Bogart died in January 1957. He was 57 years old. Lauren Bacall, who was 32 and who had spent her entire adult life with him, held his hand. He had told her, in his final weeks, that he had never expected this, the tenderness, the faithfulness, the specific quality of being truly known by another person. The man who had made a career of not expecting anything good had been, in the end, genuinely surprised by love. It was the most human thing about him, and she kept it private for years because some things are too real for the public to hold carefully enough. They gave us their light, and the darkness was the price. Every smile you loved, every performance that moved you, came from human beings who deserved the simple freedom to be themselves. Remember them for who they truly were. If their real stories matter to you, subscribe and share. The Hollywood Memory Vault keeps their truth alive because they deserve nothing less.